finally meet you after emailing and everything.
Yes, it's wonderful to meet you too, Tracy, and I'm so glad you could join me. Many of us have the privilege of knowing your work and hearing it and seeing it and reading it. For those who don't, could you please tell us about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Tracy Borman, and I'm an author, historian and broadcaster, and I mainly specialise in the Tudor period. That's what most of my books are about. And alongside my writing and TV presenting, I'm also joint chief curator for historic royal palaces. So we look after places like Hampton Court and the Tower of London. So more great Tudor history there.
Wonderful. Well, you certainly are cut out for your work. You're such an intelligent historian, but you're also intuitive and caring, and I just feel like that always lends integrity to your work and the people you work with, and so appreciative of that. So,
Thank you.
Yes. So, although they are linked together because they are mother and daughter, of course, what inspired you to bring Anne and Elizabeth I together for your book, which will be released today, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history?
Well, the idea for this book was born quite a few years ago. The second book that I wrote in my career, back in 2009 it was published, was Elizabeth's Women, about the female influences on my favourite historical figure, Elizabeth I, all-time historical heroine. And I wrote about 50 or so women in that book, but the one who intrigued me the most was Anne Boleyn, and it seemed to me that that was such a profound relationship between mother and daughter, and that it hadn't been looked at nearly enough. And the assumption had been made that because Elizabeth was less than 3 years old at the time of Anne Boleyn's execution, that she had no relationship really with her mother, or only a fleeting one. But I got a sense there was a lot more to the story. I wasn't able to research it in detail back then, but it was always lodged at the back of my mind that I'd love to come back to this and actually really explore it in depth. And so that's what I've done with this book. And it's been, to say a journey of discovery, I think would be an understatement. Fascinating.
Yes, and it's so amazing to me that it was her mother, Anne Boleyn, that stood out to you among all these women.
Yes. Exactly. Of course, Anne Boleyn is famous, very famous in her own right. But I hadn't expected her influence on Elizabeth to be quite so profound or long-lasting. I think when I wrote Elizabeth's Women, I thought, well, this is just going to be a very brief chapter because Elizabeth is only 2 years and 8 months old when Anne is executed. But actually, Anne shapes Elizabeth into the queen that she later becomes, and her influence is a lifelong one on her daughter. And so, yeah, it was a relationship that just, I don't know, spoke to me, if you like. You very kindly said about intuition. There was something about their relationship that appealed to me from the very beginning. So it was a joy to write this book.
Well, I know I'm not the only one chomping at the bit to read it. So happy for its release. And so has your study of Elizabeth, you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but has your study of Elizabeth I over the years informed your opinion of Anne Boleyn and the Boleyn family, such as Thomas Boleyn? And has it caused your opinion to change in any way? Because I have read Henry VIII and the men who made him. And so I'm just curious if this has changed your thoughts in any way about the entire family as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I find my opinion swaying from one thing to the other as I write a different subject, because you see it through their eyes. And so, of course, when I wrote my biography of Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn doesn't appear in all that good a light for quite a bit of that. They ended up enemies. And likewise in Henry VIII and the men who made him, she was the enemy to many of those men. And also, I've written about Mary, so Elizabeth's half-sister, and really Anne was quite vicious towards Mary. So I think before writing this book, my opinion of Anne was quite negative. I saw her as intriguing, certainly, but her more positive characteristics, her admirable characteristics, came out much more strongly when looking at this mother-daughter relationship. And that's when I really did come to admire Anne. I became quite fixated with her, actually. I'm still obsessed with Anne Boleyn. I think she still has that X factor, doesn't she? 500
Yes.
years on, we're still talking about Anne Boleyn. And she was incredibly courageous and charismatic. She just had this magnetic appeal. I think you would know if Anne Boleyn walked into the room. And ultimately, that was her downfall. It gave Cromwell the inspiration for bringing her down, the fact that she had all of these admirers, and that was twisted into adultery. But I think we can sum up Anne by saying she was far ahead of her time. She wouldn't have understood the word feminist, but she was arguing for female power long before feminism was even thought of. So she was really quite a remarkable woman.
Yes, I can't agree with you more, because I do think she had that certain, je ne sais quoi. And
Yes.
She was that kind of person who we might see at a party and kind of maybe not pay much attention to them, but then when we talk to them, they just grow in our esteem, and even their visage becomes more beautiful and radiant. I just think she was that kind of person for sure. And I can see what you're saying about writing from the perspective of Henry, writing from the perspective of Cromwell. And so it's interesting, because I feel like this book then rounds her out completely, and not just, and for those who will read it. So I think that's really wonderful.
Thank you. I hope so. I hope it gives a more rounded impression, because increasingly I'm thinking, and this might sound simplistic, but people are good and bad. We have a tendency, I think, to look for heroes and villains.
Yes.
But, there's a lot of grey area when it comes to people. They're complex human beings.
Yes.
And so you have to look at their flaws as well as their virtues. And that's definitely what I tried to do with Anne and Elizabeth, in fact.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And this is the fatal flaw of so many things, especially things we watch, movies, where they almost feel an impetus to select the villain and select the good guy. And then they become these flattened tropes, and that becomes somehow fact.
Yes.
So that's why this work is so important. So what was the most interesting source you found while you were researching the book?
Well, often the most interesting sources are those that appear the most dull. When you just look at the title in the archives and you think, an inventory of possessions. Well, okay, that's not going to take very long. It's going to be quite like a dry account book, really. But actually, it was the inventories of Elizabeth I and of Henry VIII that opened up the most possibilities and turned up some literal gems in there. So the inventories were taken at the time of Henry VIII's death. And what that particular one told me was the items that Elizabeth chose from her father's possessions. So his possessions were divided between his three children. Of course, Edward, as the son, got first dibs there, and then Mary, and Elizabeth got what was left. But she chose items associated with her mother, and that was so enlightening. And then looking at a later inventory taken during her own reign, you can see she's held on to them. She's still got them, and in fact, she's acquired more. She's managed to get more mementos of Anne Boleyn. So that was such a treasure trove. I think it speaks volumes, because Elizabeth, I should stress, was very discreet about her mother. She knew that Anne was still a divisive figure, so she wasn't going to make a song and dance about her in public, but in private it was a different story, and she surrounded herself with mementos of her late mother.
That's just so fascinating. And I always find it interesting to hear you speak and other historians about triangulating those deductions from things like the account books and how much it says about a person. I find that fascinating. So you also mentioned, in addition to artifacts, there are probably some places that offer keys to Elizabeth I's love for her mother and the Boleyns as a whole. Would you like to tell us about some of those?
Yes, well, where I work for part of the week is Hampton Court, and I'm very lucky as a Tudor historian to work in that amazing palace. And Hampton Court was obviously inherited by Elizabeth when she became queen, along with the other royal palaces. And there were still traces of Anne, even despite Henry VIII's best efforts to remove her from History, you can still see the intertwined H and A's that he put up when making Anne his queen. But you can also see something quite extraordinary, and it got a lot of press when the find was made public, and that was Anne Boleyn's Falcon Badge, this beautiful carved oak falcon that was discovered at auction and bought for, about £75, dollars, roughly the same these days, aren't they? And it turned out to be the real deal, one of Anne's original falcons. I like to think that was passed to Elizabeth at some stage. Certainly it must have been in safe hands, because it survived for 500 years when all of the others within reach were taken down and destroyed. And we do see as well in other palaces, Elizabeth would have seen her mother's falcon. At King's College in Cambridge as well, there's the intertwined H and A. So, Elizabeth had daily reminders of her mother in the places where she spent her time as queen.
Now, have you been doing research on the provenance of the carved falcon, Tracy?
Yes, with my colleagues in conservation, we've been doing a lot of work on this, as well as the scientific work. So, dendro dating on the wood and the paint analysis. We've also compared that falcon to those that still survive in the roof or the ceiling of the Great Hall at Hampton Court, and they are exact.
Wow.
Now the reason those falcons still survive up there is they're just too hard to reach, so I think they were painted black so people wouldn't see them. They probably had, I'm kind of even imagining how they did that, with very long poles and paintbrushes on the end of them. So they're really hard to see, and that was deliberate. Henry didn't want the falcon seen. But the dimensions are exactly the same as this newly discovered one, and it does date very precisely to the early 1530s, just the time when Henry was trying to make Anne his queen. So it's always difficult to say with 100% certainty, but I think we're at 99% certainty that this was one of Anne's original falcons. So for me, it's the find of the century, really. I'm often told about things as curator at the palaces, and I think I've got this in my attic and it's really interesting. And you have to prepare yourself for disappointment in most cases, but this one turned out to be the real deal. So very exciting.
It's so amazing. And it's also a picture of your amazing support to people like Sandra Fasoli and to James, and just to, we can trust you and bring things to you and have your full support. And it's just such an amazing thing. So
thank you very much.
Well, it's absolutely true. So to what degree would you say that Anne informed Elizabeth's life and rule? And what are some examples?
She absolutely formed Elizabeth's, I think, her entire outlook, really. Anne was a great religious reformer. Now, it would be anachronistic to describe her as Protestant, because that was too early. But she was interested in religious reform, and she bordered on heretical ideas. She imported quite radical religious books secretly, and she showed one of them to Henry, The Obedience of a Christian Man, which gave him the idea for the break with Rome. It said that kings ought to be above popes. And so Anne was definitely a reformist, and she made sure that her daughter would grow up to be of the same faith. She appointed Matthew Parker, her chaplain, to care for Elizabeth spiritually, which he did. And in fact, Elizabeth later made Parker her first Archbishop of Canterbury. So that was a real sign of the esteem in which she held him and her mother. And I think as well, Anne Boleyn had been an inspiring role model for Elizabeth as a woman who could wield power in this male-dominated age, and certainly in the male-dominated court. Now, ultimately, of course, it ended in tragedy for Anne. But Elizabeth was very, very good at learning from other people's mistakes, as well as their positive qualities. And I think, where Anne perhaps fell down is that she, like Elizabeth, loved the game of courtly love and flirtation. But perhaps she didn't show enough caution there. And so Elizabeth definitely learned from that. And she always kept this strict distance between her and her male courtiers, and yet created this kind of code of chivalry whereby she was the queen bee, of the hive of court. But, it was with good reason that her court was described as being at once gay, decent, and superb. So decent was a key word there. And I think Elizabeth learned from the lesson of her mother's example.
Yes. And she probably, I don't think it's overstepping it too much to say that she had a more secure position than her mother as monarch. And so I feel like her staying unmarried was very wise, probably.
Yeah. And I'm pleased you said that, because actually that's probably the greatest thing she inherited from Anne, in that little wonder that Anne's example had put Elizabeth off the idea of marriage altogether, and also not just because of the emotional impact of that and the fact that effectively her father had cut her mother's head off, but also Elizabeth was determined not to give away any of her power to a man, and she knew that the conventions of the day said that a wife had to do that. Whether or not the wife was the Queen of England, it didn't matter. They would have to defer to their husbands. And Elizabeth famously said, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." So I think probably, it might be simplifying it to say that Anne Boleyn inspired Elizabeth to be the Virgin Queen, but I don't think that's too far off the mark.
Yeah, I don't either, but your opinion definitely matters more than mine. But I feel the same way.
Yeah, we are pleased to agree.
So I also wanted to ask you, you've mentioned before that Elizabeth I's coronation was similar to her mother's. With that in mind, would you give us some historical context for the coronation itself?
Yes, it was so similar to Anne Boleyn. So it took place in January 1559, just a couple of months after Elizabeth came to the throne. And it was so quick because even though I agree with you that Elizabeth's position was stronger as monarch, she still had fundamental weaknesses. Half of her subjects, the Catholic half, saw her as illegitimate, a heretic. They didn't want her on the throne. So she had to assert her sovereignty very early on with her coronation. And she modelled it very, very closely on Anne's, even down to enlisting the same designers as Anne had used. Mm-hmm. And the theme was a classical theme, and also the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and there was lots of kind of references that cut across both coronations, and also the fact there was white everywhere, like there had been at Anne's. She wanted the white litter, purity, virginity, which frankly it had been a bit harder for Anne to pull off because she'd been heavily pregnant at her coronation. There was no such danger with Elizabeth. And also what you see with Elizabeth's coronation are Anne's badges everywhere, and particularly we keep mentioning the falcons, but the falcons were in very great evidence during her coronation procession. But I think the most striking example of how Elizabeth honoured her late mother at her coronation was in one of the pageants. In other words, one of the sort of the little plays or scenes that were performed or that were constructed on the processional route. And this particular one showed Elizabeth's family tree. It was like a life-size model of Elizabeth's family tree. At the bottom, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, her grandparents. On the middle tier, life-size models of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, which was the first time that Anne had been depicted since her execution. There she was proudly displayed, and then on the top tier, Elizabeth I herself. So, I've said that Anne was discreet. I've said that Elizabeth was discreet about her mother, but not always, and certainly not with the coronation.
Yeah, and I feel like at that point she probably had the confidence to do it. There's really no stopping it at that point. So I felt like she really showed her assertiveness to do that.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And she did have the confidence of having battled and waited so long to be queen, and now she was queen and she was going to enjoy her moment.
Yes, and you said something else that made me think how for Anne Boleyn's coronation, so many people think, and as you mentioned before, to say Protestant is way too early. If anything, they were Reformed Catholics. If they were really not looking to step away fully from the faith, they were looking to reform it and and weed out people that were doing things wrong. But the bottom line is, the interesting thing about Anne Boleyn's coronation is they did not want to remove a tradition. And it felt very Catholic. It was within the Eucharist Mass, and everything stayed the same. And I think that was all about supremacy and legitimacy of Anne's reign. And so I feel like that's what you're saying now about Elizabeth's coronation, that it be very clear that it's showing legitimacy and her supremacy as monarch, and that it not veer too far from tradition, and that it please her entire kingdom.
Yeah, that's so true. And you've hit on a really important point there in the history of the monarchy in general, in that the monarchy is very good at displaying continuity, like business as usual. And that's why with Anne's coronation there were very traditional elements, because it's like, here's just the next legitimate queen. And nothing's changed here. We've still upheld the ceremonies, and that was the case with Elizabeth too. And in fact, that will be the case with King Charles III too. You know, that's sense of continuity that lies at the heart of the British monarchy has been there for 1,000 years. And there's a lovely quote from the reign of Queen Victoria that says, "The sovereign always exists, the person only is changed." So this sense you always have a sovereign. It almost doesn't matter who is occupying the throne. And we saw that very, very strongly with both Anne and Elizabeth's coronations.
And that's so perfect, because it's always, you know, the king is dead, long live the king, or the king is dead, long live the queen, or, you know, that concept that's handed on at the time of death, and the coronation is finalizing that. Is so interesting. And I really have enjoyed listening to the music from Elizabeth I's coronation. Are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not actually. I've written about it, but I've never actually listened to it.
Oh, it's really nice, and it's profound to me, because it's amazing to think this was the music heard on the ground at the time. And so to listen to it is very moving for me, because I feel like it's a living history.
Oh.
But the other thing you mentioned about the white clothing that continued, and also again, that showing legitimacy and supremacy, because it also goes into the Holy Spirit and the Catholic ideals of the Virgin Mary and all of that. So it's very interesting to hear how she had the same mindset of really her father and mother about her own coronation.
Yes, absolutely. It's quite striking, really. There's so much to it, and there's so much symbolism that I think would have been understood by the people who lined that processional route and who wrote about it and left such detailed accounts. They would have understood every single nuance of meaning and what Elizabeth was trying to convey, that here I am, your new, uncontested, legitimate queen. And there was nothing wrong with my parentage. Thank you very much.
And do you think she must have known her mother was expecting her when she was crowned, because that they made that very predominant? So it's interesting to me that really this was her second coronation and her second time really being, because I feel like when Henry crowned Anne Boleyn with the St. Edward's crown and crowned her like a monarch, even though she was queen consort, he was seeing the baby, I can't remember the Latin, but in utero, like the king as a baby. And I just thought, how fascinating, really, to think this was her second time.
I know. That's a really interesting thought. She'd been there before. She'd done that processional route, albeit as a kind of unborn child. But she, that's a fascinating point.
And I often wonder, and I'm curious, I just had this thought, so forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot. But Anne Boleyn having been crowned with the St. Edward's crown, I personally feel like it's very likely that she did sit in St. Edward's chair. I mean, if she's going to get the crown, she probably got the accessory to make sense. And I know it's debatable, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they're going to pull out all the stops when it comes to using the traditional elements, emphasizing that continuity, as I keep saying, you know, when it comes to the coronation, it's all about, you know, projecting your right to be there, by using the same regalia, the same furniture that have been used in previous coronations. So I'm definitely with you on that one. I think it's highly likely that she'd have been sitting in that coronation chair.
Good, because that's how I drew her for the presentation I've been working on. I thought certainly if they're going to crown her with St. Edward's crown, they gave her the chair. It just otherwise doesn't make sense,
Absolutely.
So my next question is, do you like Holbein's work?
Surely nobody could say they don't. I absolutely love Holbein's work. And, I'm often asked, why are we so obsessed with the Tudors? And I think the main reason is Holbein, because it's like having a court photographer. He suddenly opens this window into the Tudor court, and it's quite extraordinary, the realism of his paintings and the detail. It's mind-blowing. And if ever my inspiration is lacking, if I'm having a long writing day, I just need to look at a Holbein painting or a sketch, and it feels like, they're real again. I can go back and I'm inspired again. So, absolutely.
Oh, I absolutely love that you said that. That is so wonderful. We all have different things we do to inspire us to keep going, and I love that Holbein is yours. Do you have a favorite Holbein sketch or a fact, or both, that you would like to share with us today?
I think I do. There are so many to choose from, but probably my favorite Holbein sketch is the Lady Parker,
so I'm going to
which is not the most famous, but I researched Jane Boleyn, as she became Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, who has had a really bad press in history, because I was presenting a documentary on her a couple of years ago, and I was astonished when researching her how little evidence there is for that portrayal. Like that she stitched Anne up, that she gave evidence that incriminated Anne and indeed her own husband, George Boleyn. There's virtually no evidence for that. And yet she has become this scapegoat, the pantomime villain of history. And the sketch that we have by Holbein, there is some question mark over which Lady Parker it is. Is it Jane Boleyn, or actually is it her mother? And it's intriguing, but there's a beauty to the face. She's quite a plain woman in the sketch, but there's a sort of serene beauty as well to it. And I was just mesmerized by it. She looks directly at you, in this sketch, and I found her so intriguing. Whether it is Jane or whether it's her mother, I think that one for me, it's almost like the Mona Lisa of the sketches. Yes. There's something enigmatic about it. I love it.
Yes, I looked it up so I could be looking at it while you're talking about it, and I feel like it could be Jane because of the time period.
Yes.
And so and the other thing is, it's easy to accuse someone when you're not looking at them. And there's something beautiful about looking at her face and really asking yourself, and also, of course, based on the sources, that did she really do these things? Of course she didn't. We have plenty of evidence that she did not.
Absolutely. So often you see that's what the genius of Holbein, in that he can give us a different view of a character that we only have otherwise through writing and through often very biased accounts by ambassadors or hostile sources. And another example of that is Thomas Cromwell, one of Holbein's most famous portraits. And on the one hand, when you first look at it, he looks villainous because he's kind of frowning a little bit. But then I think Holbein and Cromwell were friends. And I think Holbein was just showing Cromwell as being at work. He was concentrating. He was not kind of posing like you get a lot of the noblemen doing. He wants to be shown at his desk. He's got a pile of papers in front of him and he's concentrating quite hard. So I think that gives us the more nuanced Cromwell, and it's all thanks to Holbein.
Yeah, that makes tremendous sense, because the noble pictures are always facing at a 3/4 turn with all their rings and their fur.
Exactly.
So that makes sense. Well, wonderful, Tracy. And again, I'm so happy to talk to you. And it's so wonderful that you find Holbein your inspiration for you to continue your work, because we appreciate your work so much and enjoy what you do. So that's great.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. That's so kind of you. And it really is such a joy to talk to someone with such knowledge and insights, and you bring whole different perspectives. So I'm really so delighted that we were able to chat.
Oh, I am too. Thank you, Tracy. And I look forward to your book, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history, released today.
Thank you so much.